Welcome back to StoryTube. Today is a very exciting day. I am going to talk about one of my most anticipated releases of 2023, and that is Swordcatcher by Cassandra Clare, which apparently is everything that George R.R. Martin looks for in a fantasy. Or some might say, fantasy as it ought to be written. Before I do or say anything else, I just want to acknowledge how gorgeous this cover design is. I really love it, and I've come to appreciate it even more after reading the book. Really cool. And that being said, I am going to put it over here, so I'm not tempted to wave it around like a crazy person. Let's get the basics out of the way first. So Swordcatcher is the first book in a series called The Chronicles of Castellan. I don't know how many there are planned. I don't think Cassandra Clare has revealed that. If she has, let me know. And it's also her first adult novel and her first adult fantasy, and specifically it's an epic fantasy. She is, of course, most well known for the Shadowhunter Chronicles. There are more than 15 books. They're YA. She's been writing them for over 15 years. I have been reading them for over 15 years. And I was very excited to find out if I am a fan of Cassie's writing or if I'm just a fan of the Shadowhunter books specifically. And also just really curious to figure out what writing an adult fantasy would look like for her, because she's by no means the first person to make that transition. Big names like Sarah J. Maas come to mind, or Leigh Bardugo, amongst many, many others, and it looks a little bit differently to each author. And what is it that makes a book adult that they can't do with a YA audience? And I actually went to an event earlier this year with Cassandra Clare where she was promoting her latest Shadowhunter book, and she was talking a little bit about the constraints of YA based on some questions that she was getting from the audience. And I got the distinct sense that this is something that she's been wanting to explore for a long time, and that maybe she was a bit frustrated with the things that she might not be able to do, like have more time with adult characters and stuff like that, writing YA. So yeah, I was very, very excited to see what she would do with it. So the first thing I want to get out of the way, having said that, is that this is not a fantasy romance. It's an epic fantasy. There is a romantic subplot. There are hints, beginnings of potential romantic subplots. It's definitely a theme in it, but it's not the sole aim or the main focus of the story at all. Don't get me wrong, there is absolutely nothing wrong with fantasy romance, but I really appreciate that you can tell that she's trying to stretch her muscles and her writing style and her abilities into a more adult territory without just making it adult because it's spicier. We have a vast cast of characters. We have political intrigue. We certainly have adult themes like power and the corruption that can come with power, not just corruption in terms of corrupt politicians or rulers or monarchs or aristocracy in this case, but corruption of the spirit and how you generally are with other people and what you do and with your life and how you think about certain things and that kind of thing. And I suppose the big giveaway is that the characters are adults. However, they are still quite young. There are two POVs. They're both in their early to mid 20s and around like 23, 24, something like that. There are older characters, but there is kind of a divide of like, oh, this is the young generation and like the people that know each other of this age range. There are like our main characters, and then there are like the parent characters or like the caregiver characters. So that's quite a YA structure that still is present here, even though the main characters are not 17 and don't behave like they're 17. They have a good bit more agency, and an issue that I often have with YA is that you'll have these 16, 17-year-olds that are like criminal masterminds or, you know, the chosen one and that kind of thing, and all the parents are terrible caregivers and let their children roam around and do all sorts of crazy things. Or everybody's an orphan. So that issue is kind of remedied, obviously, because it's adult and because the characters are adults. that have a little bit more freedom and it's just more realistic. There are some YAisms in here, like an unreasonable amount of attractive people roaming around. That disappointed me a little bit because it's just a very simple thing to not do. But not so much because it's something that actually bothers me, as that I feel like it's something that people that want to criticize this book can latch onto extremely easily, or it could be something that could bother somebody and discredit or be used to discredit the strengths of the novel that are there, and it would just be a shame. So overall, I the term that comes to mind that is not actually a term that I like is new adult, where it's certainly adult themed. It is complex in the cast of characters and the world building that we're presented with. It is adult in terms of the explicit content and language. Cassandra Clare is not afraid to say fuck every once in a while, and I much appreciated that. However, there are some characteristics of YA, typical of YA, that you could find here that she evidently just likes doing, and I don't have an issue with it, but it was noticeable, and the characters are still very much in that age range where they are already adults, but they're still fully coming into themselves and finding their path in life and that kind of thing. But enough of that. I did want to talk about this YA adult transition and what that looks like, because I know it'll be on a lot of people's minds. It was certainly on my mind. But I also want to respect this book enough to review it and talk about it and discuss it as I would any other epic fantasy that is in the adult section that is marketed to adults, without having this baggage of comparing it to the Shadowhunter Chronicles all the time. Like I said, this is the first book in the Chronicles of Castellan, and it's very much a book one. It is setting up the scene, the settings, the political intrigue, the characters, and leads us into the beginning of the overarching plot of the series, essentially. So the setting is Castellan, which is a city-state governed by the Aurelian family. And the prince of the Aurelian family, his name is Connor, which Prince Connor just does not sound very fantastical to me. That took me a while to get over. Prince Connor has a sword catcher. And the sword catcher is essentially a lookalike that they find from an orphanage in the outskirts of the city as a child, and they bring him into the palace and they raise him to be the last line of defense for Prince Connor, but also his double at public events. This sword catcher will take the place of the prince and pretend to be the prince, so if there's an assassination attempt, the sword catcher will be the one who dies. And his name is Kel, and he is the main character. And then we have the other main character, whose name is Lynn, and she is one of the Ashkar, who is a community that lives within the city-states of this world, but they're not allowed to mingle with the rest of the people in the city. At night, they need to go back into their part of the city, which is walled off, and they can't leave without an escort. And they practice a little kind of magic related to like talismans and stuff like that. The rest of the magic has disappeared from the world for reasons that we find out throughout the book. So Lynn is a physician. She is the first female physician in generations or ever, really. So she struggles with that within her own community, but then outside of her community, she struggles with the fact that she belongs to that community. So we have that kind of where do I belong question. And without giving anything away, she has reasons to dislike the people of the palace and the nobility especially. And she would assume that everybody else in a similar position to her would feel that way. And you would assume that Kel, the sword catcher, would feel some kind of resentment towards the prince that he is living to die for, basically. But they're also kind of like brothers and best friends, which makes it more interesting. There's also a strong element of criminal underworld in Castellan. There's a criminal mastermind, essentially, of organized crime whose name is the Ragpicker King, which is a very cool name and the title of the second book. But there's I don't want to give anything away, but there's kind of a duality there as well between the king on the hill in the castle and the Ragpicker King in the slums on the streets of the city. I'm not entirely sure what the setting is inspired by directly, but based on the names and the languages that she uses, and like there's a little bit of an author's note at the end where she talks about the inspiration for the languages that she uses, I get the sense that we're looking at a setting similar to like 16th, 17th century France, like the Sun King and that kind of thing. There's no muskets or anything like that. There's still swords primarily as weapons, but that kind of aura of extreme luxury and extravagance and just like the nobility being extremely detached from the regular people in the city. And then we have some characters from other city-states from or neighbouring countries and coming in that could be like the equivalent of late Renaissance or post-Renaissance Italy, or like Venice or Milan or that kind of thing. And I really liked that as a setting. It was really cool. We have a lot of descriptions of like what they're eating and their clothing and things like that. And it is distinctly different from your standard Central European medieval fantasy world building. So that was cool. In terms of the plot, this is a slow book. It took a little while to get going, I will say. The prologue is 40 pages. The whole thing is over 600. And the prologue is just kind of giving you context of what you already know from reading the back of the book. So it did not need to be 40 pages. And then it takes a while to fully get into the groove of things. But then when it had me, it really did have me. And I was just interested in being with the characters and seeing where they'd go and what this world is like and learning little tidbits of information here and there. We're certainly low on the action, just learning about the world and what it looks like, what its rules are, who the people inhabiting it are, what their relationships are to each other. And I was just along for the ride. This is my brand of slow-paced, boring fantasy with very little action, of just people in a city walking around, talking to each other and doing things. And I thoroughly enjoyed it. Like the second half, I read this quite slow. It took me about 3 weeks to read. And I thought I would devour it, but I actually like enjoyed reading it slowly and like savoring it and just coming back to it like for a couple of chapters a day because of life things. It's not like I didn't want to keep going, but it is a book I think that lends itself to that because it is slow paced. I also really like the main characters. There's a few that I find quite intriguing and that I'm interested in where she goes with them. I think the character of the prince is deceptively interesting. Like he could seem like a bit of a cliche on first glance, but I think depending on where she goes with it, he could be really interesting. I also really like the character of Lynn. She's probably my favorite so far. The one criticism I would have in that regard is like some of the side characters were interchangeable and remained interchangeable for pretty much the entire thing. And I read their names and it's like, I don't know which one of these three you are. They have no distinct personalities. By the end, I had one of them pinned down, but that's about it. But yeah, overall, a really solid first book, I think, with very interesting, kind of unique world building that I enjoyed very much. Interesting characters, good characters. I'm looking forward to seeing where they go. Like I said, this is very, very much a book one. It's an intro chapter that I think I'll have to reread before getting to the second one eventually. But I'm excited. I'm excited that Cassandra Clare is writing non-Shadowhunter books, that she's writing adult fantasy. I can't wait to see where this story goes, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. I do want to leave one nugget here for my fellow Shadowhunter readers. If you have read the book, did you notice that there were like 3 or 4 mentions of herons there? And I am certain that was not a coincidence. There were also a couple of lines of like sarcasm that were reminiscent of certain Shadowhunter characters that I shall not name, but it was not that much that I felt like it was a carbon copy or like she was using the exact same tone. I think the tone is a little bit more serious and grown up overall than her YA books are. So I did appreciate there being a difference, even though you can still very distinctly tell that it's Cassandra Clare. I have rambled on for way too long already, so let me know. Have you read Swordcatcher? Are you going to read Swordcatcher? Are you interested at all? What are your thoughts? Would love to discuss. I think this was a really fun book to read and a fun one to talk about, whether it's through the lens of comparing it to the Shadowhunter books or just talking about it by itself, because I think it's doing some interesting stuff. Let me know in the comments. If you like the video, hit the like button and do all that stuff. Feel free to dislike it. If you didn't like it, that's fine. And consider subscribing to the channel if you want to hear more about what I'm reading and all that stuff. You know that. I don't need to tell you. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time.